Welcome to Three Count Commentaries. This is your host MongoSlade, and today we're going to talk about the Dark Side of the Ring Brian Pillman episode. In addition to the show, I like to do supplemental stuff that goes along with the Dark Side of the Ring. I also read the Brian Pillman book, Crazy Like a Fox. It was written by Liam O'Rourke, and it was published in 2013, I believe. So this episode is really built off the blueprint of the book. Of course, the book has a lot more details in it because the Dark Side of the Ring did skip a lot of things. So I'm going to use the episode as a spine, kind of, and I'm going to flesh it out when needed. I didn't see anything in the documentary that I had a problem with, like something that I definitely disagree with or I found contrary information to. So this is one of the few times I've been able to do that on a Vice documentary. You have to watch that Vice stuff, man. It's not always on the up and up. But so let's go through it. Let's see. They talk about Brian's voice. He had polyps on his voice, and he had 40 surgeries. That's all true. He said he had a tracheotomy. Of course, he talked about him playing football, NFL football to be exact, for the Cincinnati Bengals before going up to the Canadian Football League and playing for, I believe it was the Calgary Stampeders. While he was up in Calgary, it was not working out. He was too small. His body was also breaking down. He was having some serious injuries from, and I believe Brian in the book it says that Brian blamed steroid use because did use steroids in high school and in college, and he was not abusing, but he was using it, and it of course makes your body frail. So he wasn't really up to playing football. While he was up in Calgary, though, his strength coach for the Cincinnati Bengals, who I had befriended, named Kim Wood, the saltiest guy on earth. If you've seen the Dark Side of the Ring, he is a salty guy. He is the kind of guy you would see in a heist movie. Like, you would see him in, like, Reservoir Dogs or something. He reminded me a lot of, if you've seen the movie Pulp Fiction, the Wolf, Harvey Keitel from Pulp Fiction. You know, that's just how he just comes across. But it was Kim Wood who suggested pro wrestling, because Kim Wood was a fan. He said he used to trade tapes with Dave Meltzer, and this is kind of how Pillman gets involved. Pillman didn't know that much about wrestling. He didn't really watch it, apparently, as a kid. But while he was in Calgary, Kim Wood said, hey, you should go train with the Hearts, the wrestling people up there. And so while in the documentary, they didn't really talk about it. Kim Wood did say, like, hey, look, he started sending him tapes that he would get from Meltzer. So he sent them like Flair, Dusty, Tiger Mask, Satoru Sayama. And that basically was, Pillman's introduction into wrestling. And so he went to the Hart Wrestling School, the Dungeon, that was at the time being the training facility, which was, I think it was run by Bruce. Well, Bruce was running Stampede Wrestling at the time. So I'm pretty sure he had something to do with the training facility as well. But the Stampede at this point in time was starting to push and book smaller talent like Brian. And, they were basically saying, like, hey, this was the days where, the Bulldogs was there. And they were going back and forth between WWF and Stampede. And there were still some other guys that they were booking out of that in that territory that were Brian's size. So it wasn't like gigantic giants. But Stampede, of course, was a feeder system to the WWF. And the WWF always preferred the bigger guys. So what did he do while he was in Stampede? Well, he mostly teamed with Bruce. Bruce Hart is Bret Hart's brother, by the way, for those of you who might be too young. There's 12 Hart children. Bruce is one. Bret is one. Owen is one. So Stampede was purchased by Vince McMahon I think a couple of years before Pillman showed up, and Vince wanted to buy into the territory. He was supposed to pay $100,000 over 10 years, plus however much money he made in the territory was going to get kicked up to the Hart family. But once Vince started running in Calgary and in that area, he found he couldn't make any money. So he basically told Stu, hey, I need to go back on this deal. It's not going to work. But so Stampede Wrestling was reformed with Bruce Hart as the booker, and he took over. And the reason why the Harts was selling is because the territory wasn't doing well. And so, Vince thought he could do better, found out that he couldn't, but they maintained a close relationship. And in exchange for buying into the territory, Vince had to take all, a lot of these kids that Stu had. So it was the Bulldogs, it was Brett, it was I think was it was some other people, but it was Brett, it was the Bulldogs, I think it was Jim the Anvil Neidhart, and I believe there was a couple of other guys that Stu really wanted Vince to take care of. And, he kept those guys. So that's the part of the deal he didn't renege on. He kept Brett and Bulldog and all those guys. But he couldn't run in that territory, so Bruce was running it. So while Brian was in Calgary, he was a tag team partner with Bruce, who was the booker, of course. And everybody was was giving him a hard time about it. But that's pretty much to flesh out the Stampede experience of him being in Stampede wrestling, because they didn't really go into any details in the Dark Side of the Ring. But he was in Stampede for a little while. They talked a lot about him bullying Bill Kazmaier. If you've never seen Bill Kazmaier before, he's a gigantic, muscle guy, kind of the Braun Strowman of his day. It was really bad stuff. Maybe one day I'll talk about it in detail, but Brian really was giving Bill Kazmaier the blues, and it was sad. So in 1989, Kim Wood gets in contact with Jim Ross. Jim Ross is a notorious football fan. Kim Wood works in the NFL, so he contacts Jim Ross on behalf of Brian Pillman, sends him tapes of Brian and Stampede, gets Brian to WCW, where he makes $104,000 a year and is dubbed Flying Brian. So Brian Pillman's early days in WCW, they spent a lot of time on WCW in the book, because that's where he spent most of his career. I'm not going to go into any real, super deep detail on Brian Pillman's experience in WCW, because they kind of covered it in the Dark Side of the Ring, where they talked about the revolving door of bookers. But generally, Brian was well liked because he became drinking buddies with Ric Flair, and Ric Flair was his buddy. So when Ric Flair had the book, Brian was doing okay, and that's the shorthand, because Ric Flair, that was like 2 or 3 different times where Ric Flair was the booker of WCW. And when Flair had the book, Brian was doing all right. So he was positioned as a top babyface at 1989. He ended up wrestling Lex Luger at Halloween Havoc. He ended up being a tag team with Tom Zink. Then they had a couple of big matches at that point. Then Ole Anderson took over, and when Ole Anderson took over, Pillman was too small. Tom Zink was too small. They was just kind of like, okay, we're gonna end this. We're gonna kill this right now. And so, he decided to cut costs and bring in a bunch of older talent. A lot of these older guys were like old and bloated, like the Iron Sheik and the Junkyard Dog. And it didn't really work out. Ole Anderson ended up losing $6.5 million and ended up getting himself fired. So that was pretty much it. Then Dusty took over. So Dusty gets the book, and Dusty also brings in his guys. And some of his guys, just for some color, will be Mike Graham, Barry Windham, Magnum TA, Grizzly Smith, who was the father of Jake Snake Roberts. Mike Graham ended up taking Pillman under his wing a little bit. So he ended up booking Pillman in the War Games match, which led to the infamous Sid botch. So if you've ever seen the War Games match where Sid pretty much drops Brian Pillman on his head, that was Dusty booking, and that was Pillman's opportunity to be a top guy, and so that was, a good opportunity for him. During this time as well, he was often booked to feud with the Four Horsemen. This would be like 1991. At the time, Sid was a member of the Four Horsemen, and Sid will refuse to sell for him because Sid thought that the size difference was too great, and that, he refused to sell for Brian, and Brian was often losing anyway. But, it was just kind of to embarrass him. He refused to sell for him and call him all kind of stuff. So that was kind of it. And they didn't talk about, the light heavyweight division from WCW, where you had Pillman and Luke Liger and all those guys. He had met Liger originally in Stampede, and he kind of pitched the idea for a light heavyweight division. This was before Bischoff would create the cruiserweight division, the light heavyweight division, in the early 90s of WCW. It was an idea that they had stole from New Japan Pro Wrestling, who of course had did like the Best of Super Juniors and all that kind of stuff. It was interesting because in the book they talked about how, basically Jesse Ventura will bury the division on commentary, that basically the light heavyweight division was seen as quote unquote king of the jobbers, and that was like that's kind of how it still is today, and that's very sad. But these guys were having phenomenal matches. Brian Pillman actually got a bonus for one of his matches with Liger at Super Brawl 2. We got a $2,500 bonus. And things change again because Jim Herd is out. Bill Watts is in. Bill Watts keeps Dusty on the book, but Bill Watts changes the entire fucking structure of WCW. He doesn't really care about the light heavyweight division. He actually wants to make the centerpiece of the light heavyweight division. Instead of it being Pillman and Liger and guys like that, he actually wanted Brad Armstrong, who he had booked in Mid-South Wrestling several years before. So he would try to book the division around Brad Armstrong, and it didn't really work out. But Brian finally gets his turn heel around this time. And then Watts starts talking about cutting his money. He was making too much money and and that kind of thing. So when the light heavyweight division stuff wasn't really working out because Ole Anderson had come back as a road agent under Bill Watts, things was really hard because Watts was really big on busting contracts, especially that guaranteed money, because Ole and Bill Watts were old school guys who believed that guaranteed money breeds laziness. And I can't tell you that that's wrong. But these guys did not want their money cut. I can tell you that. So this brings us to the Hollywood Blondes. Now, the Hollywood Blondes, of course, was mentioned in the documentary because in the Dark Side of the Ring, because Stone Cold Steve Austin was in the Dark Side of the Ring. So this is where you get the Hollywood Blondes around 1993. And so to set the stage about the Hollywood Blondes, Stone Cold Steve Austin was supposed to be in a singles feud against, I believe it was Lex Luger, for the United States title. But what ended up happening is Dusty gave the spot to Dustin, his son, who would later become Goldust. So Austin got screwed because of nepotism, and Pillman wasn't doing anything anyway. So they just threw them together. And Raven came up with the name because Raven was their friend. Well, Raven was their buddy at the time. And he came up with the name the Hollywood Blondes. And it was basically a name that he had heard people using before. They had been in other territories, and so the Hollywood Blondes became this really big thing. And they had a short run. One of the biggest feud they would have would be their feud with the Four Horsemen, which led to the one match with Ric Flair and Ric Flair's return match after his comeback to the WCW from WWF. That failed to draw at the Clash of Champions, and like they said in the Dark Side of the Ring, what ended up happening is the Hollywood Blondes ended up taking the L because, hey, Flair can draw. We know Flair can draw. So if it wasn't Flair that tanked the rating for this, then it had to be Austin and Pillman. So therefore, they were broken up. So the next big thing Brian would do, he would join the Horsemen in like 94, 95. And he ended up doing this because, he was actually very, again, well liked by Ric Flair. And he was brought in, and the Horsemen at the time were Flair, Arn, Benoit, and Pillman. And this is where the beginning of the loose cannon character came from. It's because, Brian had sat down and said that, hey, his contract is going to be coming up. And he wanted to make what he called Lex Luger money. For some reason, Lex Luger was his white whale. He wanted to make as much money as Lex Luger. So that would put him in the $450,000 to $500,000 range. And there was no way Bischoff was going to give him that money. So he sat down with Kim Wood and came up with this plan to, quote, con the con men and to trick Bischoff into, letting him negotiate with Vince McMahon to come up with more money. And this was where the long con comes from. And they talked a lot about this in the Dark Side of the Ring, that him and Kim Wood basically came up with the plan to use Vince to drive up the cost on Bischoff. Now, the issue here, it becomes what Meltzer thinks, what Kim Wood thinks. Kim Wood thinks that the ultimate goal was to get Vince McMahon, who he called the whore, that, what do you do with a whore? You fuck him. That's Kim Wood's, mindset, that, our plan was to get Vince McMahon to give him all this money. Dave Meltzer, who was Kim Wood's buddy, believes that the plan was to get Bischoff to be the one to give him all the money. Now, the reason why this is different is because Pillman did not want to go to the WWF, because he had seen what happens to other people who went to the WWF, who got their names changed. They got their, the characters changed. They basically, you came in, they slapped whatever on you, and you had to go do that. Pillman didn't want to do that. So the plan was to drive up the cost, obviously, and then go with the highest bidder, but he really would have preferred to stay with WCW. So this was a long time, and they went through a lot of this in the book about how all the different things Brian was doing to get his interest up in this loose cannon character. And they showed, of course, a lot of the old wrestling with the pencil and ECW. I Respect You, Booker Man with Kevin Sullivan. The thing when he made Bobby Heenan curse on television, and it was a lot of stuff. And there was some stuff in the book that Pillman wanted to do that that he never really got a chance to do. One such story comes from Mark Madden, who is a friend of Brian Pillman. Mark Madden was going to cover the Super Bowl, the year 1995. And this was, I think, the Steelers versus the Cowboys or something like that. And Brian Pillman had the idea to borrow Mark Madden's press pass because he worked for a Pittsburgh newspaper. And his plan was to borrow Mark Madden's press pass, jump on the field, and handcuff himself to the goalpost. And Mark Madden was like, that would be a fantastic idea. But if you take my press pass and jump onto the field at Super Bowl and handcuff yourself to the goalpost, I'll lose my job, and then I'll never be able to cover sports in the state of Pennsylvania ever again. But they were just coming up with these wild ideas of crazy stuff to do, and Bischoff was in on some of it. In the Dark Side of the Ring, they did do a lot of Kim Wood basically laughing at Bischoff, saying like, how bad could we have worked him that he thought he was in on it? But Bischoff was in on a lot of it. He kind of had to be, because he was under WCW contract for a lot of this stuff. But there was plenty of stories of Brian Pillman calling radio shows to act up and cuss people out and rant and rave on the radio to get people to really believe that he was crazy. And at first, before it was called the Loose Cannon, they were basically just calling him the Rogue Horseman. That he was basically the one stallion in the group that would not act appropriately. He was just acting crazy and stuff like that. And this, of course, was around the time that he went to Las Vegas to the National Association of Television Program Executives. And this is where he took the infamous picture with Vince McMahon, because he had used Dave Meltzer's press pass because Dave Meltzer was leaving. He used Dave Meltzer's press pass to push his way in, and Brian Pillman always had a camera with him. That was another thing that I probably should have said. That he liked cameras. Photography wasn't exactly his thing. He just liked, he was using it to get attention, just walking up, taking pictures of people. And he managed to push his way into a meeting with Vince because he knew Jim Ross, and Jim Ross was there. So he walked over to Jim Ross, gave Jim Ross this big, obnoxious hug, and whispered in his ear that, it's all a work. So JR would know what was going on. And then he, confused Vince picture that he took with Brian Pillman, which is great, by the way. That's a tremendous story. Vince just happened to be there. The guy who he was looking to get hold of the whole time just happened to be there. And then it was Pillman who spread the picture around the dirt sheets that, he was in talks with the WWF and all that kind of stuff. And basically he was utilizing the dirt sheets at the time to drive up interest in him going to the WWF. His sole interest in going to the WWF was that the WWF was willing to feature smaller talent, something that WCW was not doing. He was also fixated on Shawn Michaels. That was another thing. That's why you probably saw in the documentary where he says that he was going to have surgery to look like Shawn Michaels. There's at least 2 or 3 different Shawn Michaels stories in the book about him. He wanted to crash Madison Square Garden during a Shawn Michaels main event and basically just unmask and get the crowd to react because he wanted to get Shawn's attention. For some reason, he was fixated on Shawn Michaels. But that was his sole interest in wanting to work for the WWF, because he knew that if he could work there and make big money, they would have to push him. And they didn't mind pushing smaller guys. In WCW, however, it's Hogan and, guys like that. He was not going to get that look. So let's talk a little bit about Pillman and ECW, because in Dark Side of the Ring they showed the clip, the first clip. It was but Pillman spent, well, they didn't show the whole thing. They basically just showed him showing up, him with the stance, and he had the cane and everything. And that was a big moment. But Pillman spent several weeks in ECW, off and on, of course, because he was still under contract to WCW. And so the book just talks a lot about some of the stuff that he was saying and doing in ECW, and it was completely out of control. So one of the things that he tried that was talked about in the book is that he was never paid by ECW. When he was in ECW, Heyman never paid him. He was paid by WCW. This is why, when people say Bischoff wasn't in on it, he was. He was still paying Pillman to go out and drum up interest by going to ECW. And Heyman knew that that's what they were doing too. But Heyman just didn't care because he figured, hey, if WCW is going to give me a guy like Brian Pillman, I'm going to use him. He couldn't wrestle though. So that's why he never wrestled in ECW. Even though he talked up a lot of story lines and story angles, he never actually wrestled because he was still under contract with WCW. But this appearance where he threatened to piss in the ring and he called the fans the real marks and talked and stuff like that, saying that the real marks are, people who think OJ is innocent. Or he says, or was it that, the real marks are the people who think OJ did it? It was one of those two that he has said. I can't remember off the top of my head. But this is where he started his own hotline. Back then, hotlines were a big deal. He had 1-900-288-PILL. That was a big hotline so that people could call and get the scoop of where he was going to sign and what he was doing. He also had his own AOL chat room that he would go into and cut these really mean and vicious promos on guys. And Pillman was unfiltered. Like especially his run in ECW, he was dropping N-bombs and stuff. There is a story in the book about him, saying that Mustafa and New Jack are the fake niggas with attitudes. And New Jack flipped the lid because he said this in front of everybody. So he basically just dropped the N-bomb in front of everybody. And I wish I could have found a video of it. But they wouldn't have put it in the book if it didn't happen. But there's, of course, him wrestling the pencil, and he created the Cannon Cult, which of course is the AOL thing. But they talked about a little bit about this in the Dark Side of the Ring. That this is around the time Ken Wood started telling Meltzer that what was going on, and that Ken Wood was like, "Oh yeah, the real marks are Bischoff and Vince, and we're trying to get them to invest in Brian and keep his name alive and all that kind of stuff." So there's like tons of stories about Brian and ECW talking up different matches that never occurred, storylines with him and Shane Douglas, who he was friends with from WCW. Just a lot of stuff. I'm probably going to end up having to skip a lot of that stuff. But there was something that was very interesting that took place. While Brian was away not on WCW TV, he was making a big name for himself. And Hulk Hogan found out about this. And Hogan immediately saw through it and knew that it was a work. And it knew that, so he called Bischoff and he basically forced Bischoff to tell him that this was a work. So Bischoff ended up telling him it was a work. So Hogan then, in the book, Bischoff would probably say it didn't happen. But in the book, it was claimed that Hulk Hogan had created this absurd 1-on-4 match for Nitro. And it was going to be 4 heels versus just him, right? And once he found out about Brian Pillman and, all of this stuff, he changed it to a 2 versus 8 match. And then he told Bischoff to bring Brian Pillman back so that he could work in this 2 versus 8 match and be one of the 8 guys against him in that match. So that's absurd. This is around the time where Brian Pillman wanted to crash a WWF match in Madison Square Garden to confront Shawn Michaels. So he was planning to do that. And WCW was planning to put him in a 2 versus 8 match to job him out to Hulk Hogan. That's what their plan was. So Pillman was called back to Nitro, where he did a segment, basically just a basic brawl with Hogan and Savage and all those guys. Basically, he did his best to stay away from Hogan. And then he went off and had surgery to avoid this 2 versus 8 match. So he no-showed the show. So he was supposed to be in the 2 versus 8 match, and he didn't show up. It was like the silly cage match idea, and that kind of put Bischoff in a bad position with Hogan and that kind of stuff. So, but that's a crazy story, and I'm surprised Dark Side of the Ring didn't use that story because it's phenomenal that you got this guy who was getting super over on the dirt sheets and stuff like that. And Hogan's first idea is to put him in a 2 versus 8 match against him and then beat him. He was going to be the guy to take the fall, by the way. That was Hogan's plan, was to get hit Pillman with the big leg drop. And Pillman was like, absolutely not. I'm not doing it. And so he went and had an elective surgery to avoid it. So after that, Pillman figured he couldn't trust Bischoff anymore. So this is where he comes up with the brilliant idea to force Bischoff to really release him, because he wanted to actually be able to negotiate with Vince. So he couldn't do that as long as he was still under contract. So he says he went, so the story goes, he actually went to Bischoff and says, it needs to be legitimate Turner letterhead that says that I am no longer working for WCW. And Bischoff is like, well, we'll come up with something, yada, yada, yada. And Pillman's like, no, it needs to be a real document. You need to really fire me. So people will believe that it's the work. You have to really fire me. And then Bischoff really sent him a Turner letterhead releasing him from his contract. So, and this is where, Kim Wood is laughing at Bischoff because he's like, oh, he thinks he's in on it. And it's like, Bischoff is like, I was in on it. It was at the point where he really did fire him to give him the opportunity to drive up the cost. Now, in the Dark Side of the Ring, they talk a lot about Bischoff saying, hey, the money that he wanted, the Luger money, the $450,000, couldn't justify that based off of Pillman's history of drawing or not being able to draw. And there was just no way he was going to be able to pay him that kind of money. But he wanted to help him boost up his value. So in order to do that, he had to go and talk to Vince. So that's why he really released them. Now, of course, as he was doing negotiations, he was still doing the ECW thing, and this is where he ended up crashing his Humvee. So on April 15th, 1996, Brian Pillman gets into a crash. He was speeding. In the Dark Side of the Ring, Melanie said that she thinks that Brian fell asleep at the wheel. In the book, they didn't give a direct cause of the crash other than they said Brian took his eyes off the road and maybe he dropped something and he was already speeding. He took his eyes off the road and crashed. But it sounds like, it might have been drugs and alcohol related, even though I don't think he was tested, because I don't think back then they probably didn't. But this was his injuries. He had a completely destroyed ankle. It was absolutely crushed. He had a broken nose, a broken eye socket, a broken cheekbone, a shattered jaw, shattered gums, and he had plates in his skull. And he was still negotiating with both WCW and WWF at the same time, even though he was seriously injured. So on May 23rd, a little over a month after the crash, Brian went to meet with Vince McMahon. And this is where he told Vince, hey, look, I don't want you to change my name. I want to keep all of my own merchandise money. I want guaranteed money, 6 figures guaranteed. Vince didn't do guarantee money at the time. So that was kind of a red flag. And he says, that he walked away from that deal thinking Vince is going to acquiesce to what I want. He's going to give me a guaranteed contract. He's going to let me keep my name. He's going to let me keep my outside merchandise money from the hotline and all that other stuff that I was doing. He thinks he's hot shit. So then Bischoff calls him and says, okay, I can get you the $425,000, which is what he wanted. That's the Luger money that he really wanted. There was one problem with, he got the money that he wanted. But WCW had a clause in all of their contracts that if you made that kind of money, it had to be negotiated every 90 days. So Pillman was injured. He was, hopped up on pain meds. He was like, absolutely not. I do not want that clause in the contract. You have to take it out. Bischoff is like, look, it's out of my hands. It's a Turner thing. It's a WCW thing. I can't do it. I can't drop it. So he goes to WWF and they offer him a downside guarantee. Somewhere between $250,000 and $400,000. I'm guessing it's probably somewhere in the middle. And he was able to keep his independent merch and outside income and do some independent shows. Basically, he got to continue doing ECW if he wanted to. And since Bischoff would not drop that 90-day negotiation clause in the 3-year contract, he signed with the WWF. So there were some ideas. They did the whole press conference on June the 17th on Raw. Apparently, what the clip that goes around, the clip that was actually showed on Raw was just a piece of what it was, and that after he did the old crying thing, Pillman will launch into this raging heel promo, but they didn't show all of it because they wanted to, save it for later and stuff like that. But some of the ideas for his initial WWF run was they pitched an idea there will be a heel stable with Triple H, Steve Austin, and Mr. Perfect. Of course, they ended up falling through. They also wanted him to do a Piper's Pit type of segment. That ended up falling through as well. But one of the reasons why a lot of these ideas started falling through is because Pillman had a lot of heat in WWF due to his guaranteed contract and the amount of money he was making with no history of being a draw or, being kind of colored a WWF guy. Well, a WCW guy rather. And particularly in the book, they talked about Undertaker and Triple H essentially just not liking him. Now, he had problems with Undertaker from WCW. They had wrestled a match and the finish somehow got botched, and so they were kind of on the outs already. He didn't really know Triple H, but Triple H would like go up with bury him online and stuff like that. They've had like some AOL chats and stuff like that Triple H had basically that who the hell is this guy? Who do you think he is? That kind of thing. So it was they were going to make it hard for Pillman. Around this time, Brian finds out that his ankle is not healing properly. So it needed to be rebroken and reset. So he had to go through that all over again. He couldn't put any weight on it. But since he had gotten the big money contract, it was time now to actually earn the money that he was getting. So he wanted to continue working. So he didn't want to bust that contract. So he was working on the injured leg, which is, a huge mistake. So from the biggest angle he would be a part of course, would be the Pillman's Got a Gun, the home invasion segment, where where Steve Austin is storming the house of Brian Pillman, beating up less Thatcher students. So if you didn't know, the guys who were getting beat up outside of outside of Brian Pillman's house, who were supposedly family and friends and neighbors and stuff like that, who was protecting poor old injured Brian. They were students of Les Thatcher who used to run Heartland Wrestling. Um, so they did the whole Pillman 9mm angle, and in the book it says that this angle actually did not draw. That once you would think that once the gun came out, the issue people would be spiked in interest, but they said no. Actually, what ended up happening is a lot of kids turned to WCW. So it didn't really work. The craziness of the angle didn't really work, but it was a fantastic fucking angle. I'm sorry. I thought it was great when I was 14 and it happened. So I think it's great today. It was fantastic. It was some of the realest shit ever produced in a wrestling program. So around this time also, Brian had been doing the Shotgun Saturday Night thing, and he was stealth retired. As I always say that when they put you behind a desk, buddy, it's pretty much over. But he was fighting to come back, and that's when he ended up in the Heart Foundation. That when he heard the original idea for the Heart Foundation, and there were going to be baby faces in Canada, heels in the United States, he thought that's stupid. I don't want to be a part of that. So he started coming up with his own ideas. Because he wanted to go solo. He did not want to work with. I mean, he was friends with Brett because obviously because of Bruce, but he was more friends with Bruce and Owen because Owen was another guy who wrestled in Stampede Wrestling in the later days. And he didn't really want to be a part of the Heart Foundation because he didn't believe it would work. So Brian Pillman did not wrestle a WWF match until May 17th in Madison Square Garden. He finally got a match, and it was in a 6-man tag, and he was in an abnormal amount of pain afterwards. He had been doing HGH, he had been doing steroids. His left leg was incredibly weak due to the amount of surgeries he's had on that ankle, and it was kind of atrophied a little bit. He worked his first Raw match on May 26th, so he was in real trouble around this time, and he was in a lot of pain. Dark Side of the Ring didn't touch at all the Pillman Goldust situation, which led to him wearing a dress, and ultimately was the last angle he was involved with before he died. But so let's talk a little bit about that. So the Pillman Goldust feud was based on him dating Terry for real in 1990. So 7 years prior, he had been in a relationship with Terry before he met Melanie. And they broke up because he found out that his girlfriend Rochelle, the one who committed suicide, that she was pregnant with his daughter Brittany. So when he found out she was pregnant with his daughter Brittany, he dumped Terry and said that, okay, once we get this family thing sorted out, I'll come back. It never happened. She ended up dating Dustin. Then they all meet in WWF. Somebody finds out that they used to date, and they decided to put it on TV, and it made everybody uncomfortable, and nobody really wanted to do it, but they did it anyway. So, it was this real big, ugly angle that they were doing. Around the same time, also WWF's drug policy changed. They used to drug test people randomly, and then because it was becoming too expensive, they just basically decided that we were only going to drug test if it was going to be internal policing. Basically, if the boys thought that you were too fucked up, they would tell somebody, and then they would drug test you. And essentially, that's what happened with Brian. He was so fucked up that people would tell JR, like, look, he's too out of it. He's fucked up. You have to test him. And so then Brian's like, look, hey, he got the victim complex because he's doing a bunch of drugs. He's doing painkillers. He's doing coke. He's on HGH. He's taking minimal amounts of steroids. And he's like, hey, why are you singling out me? I'm not the only one popping pills around here. And he's pointing at Sean from popping pills, and he's got, talking about other people popping pills. And they're like, well, no, if you're totally fucked up, you need to take the drugs. And he basically says, like, look, all you're going to catch is the scripts. And so he was tested. What came back was he tested positive for prescription pain meds and low levels of anabolic steroids. And the lowest level of anabolic steroids, it was so small that it wasn't worth punishing him over. But this pretty much destroyed his relationship with Jim Ross. And basically, they talked about that too in the documentary, that him and Jim Ross had a falling out after that because he felt like Jim should have been looking out for him. But there was just nothing he could do. Now in Dark Side of the Ring, Kim Wood talked about one of the last times he saw him. His body was swollen from HGH use. That is, one of the things that Brian Pillman was taking. He was taking HGH. Melanie in the Dark Side of the Ring talked about Brian nodding off and crashing rental cars. He crashed 3 different rental cars, so she was not lying about that. And obviously, just to go back to the angle with him and Terry, this led to the BDSM angle where he was doing the Brian Pillman Triple X files at the time with Terry and Dustin and that storyline. And this was the last storyline he was involved in before he died October the 5th, 1997. So the official cause of death was arteriosclerotic heart disease with a left ventricle hypertrophy. And part of this was due to his cocaine abuse and his HGH abuse. So to be a little bit more nerdy, what happened is he has a genetic family issue as far as heart conditions are concerned, but he was also abusing his body. So what happens is there's plaque hardening around in his arteries, cutting off the blood flow to his brain, but the HGH use had enlarged the size of his heart, and the cocaine abuse had was forcing his blood to pump his heart to work harder. So because he was taking so much cocaine, even though he didn't get busted with cocaine, and because the HGH use had enlarged his heart, HGH was not really a big deal at the time in 1997. People would get busted for it a lot more in the 2000s. But it enlarged his heart, and the ventricles and all that stuff in his heart had pretty much constricted. He pretty much had a heart attack in his sleep. So that was the official cause of death, but there was like a mixture of drugs and a natural inclination in his family of having heart conditions. So Dark Side of the Ring, of course, talked about, Jim Cornette finding out about Brian Pillman being dead because he called the hotel because Brian Pillman had pretty much no-showed Bad Blood, and he was supposed to be on the show to wrestle Goldust again. He didn't make it. And so that was very tough. Now, the Melanie segment. So Dark Side of the Ring played the Melanie segment. They played pieces of it. It is probably number 6 in the top 5 worst things WWF has ever done. As bad, and that shit was completely cringe. I hated it at the time. It was absolutely horrible. But on the list of fucked up things that they've ever done, the questioning was more fucked up than the actual thing that they did. But Jim Ross and Dark Side of the Ring basically said, "Oh yeah, we were trying to pop a rating." In the book, there was a little bit more of a calculated effort to get out of talking about steroids. That essentially, because Vince had been on trial for steroids just a couple of years before that, and this is absolutely true, he was on trial for steroids in like 1992, 1991, 1992, that he wanted to get in front of it and say that Brian Pillman did not die from steroid abuse, that he died from prescription pain meds. And so he basically put his wife on TV just to say that, which is absolutely fucked up. And now that I keep talking about it, it might be creeping up to being the top 5 worst things that they've ever done on WWF TV. It's some horrible shit. But Melanie basically said she didn't remember it, and that she was asked to be on the show and she just went on the show. So that was nutty. That was some crazy stuff, and that was a bad way to remember Pillman, to put his grieving wife on TV less than a day after he had died. Insane. Now, in the book, Brian Pillman Jr. was says that he didn't believe his mom was actually sad when she was on TV. That was the his old way of feeling about it. I'm glad to see that they are rebuilding their relationship according to Dark Side of the Ring. This book was written 7 or 8 years ago, so obviously things change. The whole thing with the family, if you notice, I skipped a lot of that stuff because it's very it's not confusing. It's actually very sad. I'll talk about it if I have enough time. I just wanted to make sure we get enough of the actual career stuff in. For 4 years after Brian Pillman died, from 1998 to 2001, I believe, Les Thatcher of Heartland Wrestling would do Brian Pillman tribute shows. And it would be talent from WWF, WCW, and ECW all working these shows. Vince would let Austin go to these shows, but Austin couldn't wrestle at them. 1 year, Austin was not able to go, but donated $10,000. Over the next 4 years, Les Thatcher raised $120,000 for the Pillman family, in addition to all of the royalties and everything that the WWF had been sending them for Brian Pillman. And apparently all of that stuff went into drugs and alcohol, because Melanie apparently wasted all of it. And all of the Pillman tribute shows ended up stopping because the wrestling promotions went out of business. WCW and ECW went out of business, and Melanie was being a headache. Basically, people didn't like her, so they basically was kind of like fuck them, and that's sad. And that stature, it became very expensive for him to run those shows, so he was never able to do them again. And they talked about a lot about that in the book, about how Melanie was just absolutely a horrible, drug addicted nut job in the entire book. But I skipped all that stuff. So the funeral, Steve Austin did not go to the funeral. In the book, Steve Austin went to the same wake that Vince McMahon and Jim Ross went to, and that nobody from the WWF actually went to Brian Pillman's funeral. So that's kind of, sad to hear, but it makes sense when you consider that Melanie was, being weird. So, just to hit on some other notes of things that took place, obviously Rochelle, who committed suicide, the wife of Brittany Pillman, the second daughter of Brian. She was taken from her mother. Her mother had all kinds of self-esteem issues, drug issues. She had disappeared for a point in time. And Melanie and Brian were, just kind of like done with her and decided to take control of Brittany from her. And she essentially called her mother on the phone and shot herself. She was trying to get in contact with Brian, but he wouldn't talk to her. Melanie used to date the Ultimate Warrior. And so when they would get into arguments, Melanie would always compare him to the Ultimate Warrior. And that thing was real ugly. And then when he died, she was dating the Ultimate Warrior's chauffeur, some weird guy. She brought him to the funeral. Of course, they talked about it in Dark Side of the Ring about the stepfather, who was not the Ultimate Warrior chauffeur, but some other guy who was abusive to the kids. She ended up having another baby with him. So there was 5 Pillman kids. Uh, Three of them were Brian's. Brian had 2 daughters, and Brian Pillman Jr. Melanie had 2 kids when she met Brian, and then she had another one after he died. So, but it was really ugly, and Melanie and Brian really did drove Rochelle to commit suicide, and that left Brittany living with Brian and Melanie, and Melanie was not very nice to Brittany and was abusing her. And then when Brian died, Brittany still had to stay with Melanie. And so that was even more fucked up because Melanie is not her birth mother. So it was a real ugly, almost trailer trash type of situation that they had as far as their family life is concerned. It was a lot of violence, a lot of vulgarity. Brian cussing out Melanie all the time. Melanie saying that he was abusive, divorcing him, changing the locks on the door, making him break into his own house. They talked about him using that cane that he always had, that he would use the cane to bust the windows of the house to try to get inside. Because when he was in Calgary working the Canadian Stampede pay-per-view, she changed the locks on the doors. And that, she filed for divorce and shit, and used the fact that he had to break into his own house as a way to get a restraining order against him. It was really ugly, ugly, ugly shit. But Brian Pillman, as far as I'm concerned, I'll always remember Flying Brian, the light heavyweight champion of WCW, the matches with Liger, and of course all of the loose cannon stuff. Austin 316 versus 9 Pillman 9 double M's. But that was fantastic. His WWF stuff was not the best he could do. Obviously, he was completely destroyed after the car accident. Wouldn't be the first time Vince bought a lemon. You also had the same thing with Kerry Von Erich. When Vince signed Kerry Von Erich, Kerry ended up losing a foot and was addicted to drugs, and pretty much he ended up getting fired for drugs though, and ended up committing suicide. But it was a crazy story, and Pillman story, and it's a cautionary tale for sure. Because the documentary, the book says that when WWF made the documentary in 2006, and they essentially took the opportunity to frame Brian Pillman's story as kind of the scrappy underdog who overcame, size differentials and all these different things in order to make something of himself and make it in the wrestling business. And the book kind of told a more brutal story that Pillman didn't make it, that he never was a big star in wrestling. He was infamous, but he was never like a big money drawing babyface or a big money drawing heel. So he was kind of a guy who died before he got to that point. So that was a very interesting thing. And of course, there was a lot of blame put on WWF for not having a drug policy that was more stringent at the time. Of course, people continue to even recently saying that it was a joke. Of course, people are always going to do drugs and stuff like that. So, but this should be a cautionary tale because many wrestlers ended up dying from painkillers. But Pillman was the first one to die WWF watch from drugs. He was the first one. So a lot of the bad decisions that they made, like putting Melanie on TV, was them trying to scramble and figure out how to cover up the PR damage of Pillman dying on their watch. Of course, it didn't help because Owen Hart would die later and then Eddie Guerrero immediately after that. And of course, they would still be blamed for all of the people who suicide and died in the wrestling business even after Brian Pillman. But Pillman is a very interesting story. It's a great story of the guy who ended up working a lot of the boys, ended up working Meltzer, worked Vince, worked Bischoff. It's an amazing, almost heist-like story of a guy who was just trying to get a better contract. Like that's all he wanted. He's a small guy in the business of big guys who just wanted to be the top guy and make all the money. That's all he wanted. He didn't want to be world champion. He didn't really care. He just wanted to be in main events and make big money. That's all he cared about. And this is the lengths that he went to chase that goal. That's basically what the loose cannon character is, I'm sick of being the light heavyweight guy. How could I become the world fucking champion? How could I become the man? in a company where I'm never going to be able to beat up a Hulk Hogan. And what the hell am I going to do? You know? And the loose cannon is what came up out of this. And basically, it was another Heath Ledger situation where once Brian started doing the character, it became who he was, and it took him over and ended up killing him. So he is, in a sense, wrestling's version of Heath Ledger. You know, he was a guy who was so good at what he did that ended up completely eating him, swallowing him whole. And the loose cannon actually killed Brian Pillman. You know, it's so unfortunate. But this has been a long video. Thank you guys for your time. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel. Thank you guys. Talk to you guys later, man. Peace out.